Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, let's talk about my top 10 favorite sci-fi fantasy books from 2021. So I talked about some of these kind of halfway through the year. I did a favorite books of 2021 so far video that I'll link down below where I talked about some of these. So how I'm going to do this video today is I'm going to talk about first the books that I hadn't already mentioned in that video, and then the books that I had already mentioned from that video, I won't go as into detail about why I loved them because you can see a lot of those thoughts already, but I'll still also talk about why I love them and gush a little bit in this video as well. So let's go ahead and get started. These are in no order except until we get to my favorite book of the year. I do have a clear favorite. So the first one I wanted to talk about is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, which I feel like was everywhere in the community last year, I think, and this year where a lot of people were picking it up from the hype of last year. It, I think, was well deserving of the hype. Everyone describes it as a warm hug in a book. I can't agree more. It is about this social worker named Linus who is assigned this orphanage where he encounters children who each have different abilities or are different types of creatures. They're all very unique from one another and they're kind of outcast from the rest of society. And he quickly discovers why they're also so deserving of love. And the characters in this book are just the most precious. It made me smile throughout the entirety of the book. I just thought it was the sweetest book about love and acceptance and not judging a book by its cover, and just, it was so sweet. I loved it. I loved it as much as everyone else. I feel like everyone has talked at length about this novel, so I don't know that I have much more to add, just that it was the sweetest. And I will say, I think my favorite character, I've seen a lot of people absolutely love one specific character. I forget, what's his name? Like the little putty character who wants to be the bellhop. I know a lot of people love him. I love him, don't get me wrong. But I think my favorite is Lucy. I love Lucy so much. So this one definitely had to make the list. It's just so heartwarming, so sweet. It was such a great escape for a while, you know, from the world. It's just beautiful. The next one I have is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in his Skyward series, which is a young adult sci-fi series. And this one is by far my favorite. Unfortunately, some of the later books in this series, I'm not a huge fan of, Cytonic, but Skyward was so fantastic. It was an easy 5 stars. It follows a girl named Spensa who, her father, when she was very young, he was a pilot, a part of this kind of military fighting these aliens who are threatening their planet, and he, during a very important battle, is seen fleeing the battle and is labeled a coward. And now that Spensa's older, she wants to be a pilot like her father, but the fact that she comes from this coward, people don't really trust her, so she kind of has to fight against those expectations of her. And the crew that she gets put with is so fantastic. Their dynamic between each other, I absolutely loved. I loved how high the stakes felt in this book. Like, there were some real consequences that these characters had to suffer through. And I also love some of the side characters that get introduced that are kind of like the companions of Spensa. They're fantastic. I don't want to say anything too much to spoil it, but if you've read the book, you might know who I'm talking about specifically. Absolutely love that character. The mystery aspect of this one is what really kept me captivated throughout. You're trying to figure out, as you're going through Spensa's journey through pilot school, you're trying to figure out why these aliens are attacking them and why they're attacking them in the way that they are. And it's really intriguing. And you're also, so you're dealing with that mystery, but you're also dealing with a mystery about kind of why her father turned coward, and did he really? There's a lot of questions around there, and it's such a fascinating mystery that keeps you so engaged and you just want to know the answers so bad. Unfortunately, in later books, when you get answers, I don't particularly love the answers, but I loved the questions it was asking and that mystery aspect of this novel. So Skyward was definitely top 10, I loved it. I just don't know that I love the sequels as much, unfortunately. A sequel I did love, though, is The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This is the second book in the Poppy War trilogy. The Poppy War is still my favorite, but The Dragon Republic really does expand the world a little bit more, and it brings in a new people. Without giving too much away, it brings in a new people that were really fascinating to see the characters interact with. I love these books because of the historical events that they are inspired by and kind of how they weave in some of the real historical events pretty organically into this fantasy novel and setting. I love that stuff. I also loved Rin. I loved the expansion of the magic system in this book. I loved her dynamic with some of the other characters in this book. I just loved the journey throughout this entire book that Rin was going on. Unfortunately, the third book was not my favorite. That is not going to be making this list, but The Dragon Republic was fantastic, 5 stars. The Poppy War and The Dragon Republic are why the Poppy War trilogy as a whole still makes my top 10 fantasy series of all time. It's just The Burning God wasn't my favorite, but I loved what this one introduced, what it expanded upon. So this one had to make the list as well. The next one I have is a more recent read, and that is The Shadow of the Fox by Julie Kagawa. And this whole Shadow of the Fox trilogy I did finish this year, and it's just so cute. It's a YA fantasy that is very Japanese inspired. It introduces a lot of Japanese mythology and folklore and just introduces you to all these creatures, and it's just so sweet and cute, and I loved it. I love our main character. So we're following a girl named Yumeko. She is kitsune, which is like half fox, and very early on in the book she gets put into a situation where she has to journey and protect this scroll that is entrusted to her. If this scroll fell into the wrong hands, someone could use it to bring back this demon and essentially ruin the world if they wanted to. So she has to keep this safe, and she, along the way, meets a character named Tatsumi, who is kind of this ex-samurai character, and they are so cute. It is like the grump sunshine trope, if you know what that is, where the girl in this book is so sweet, so happy, so optimistic, so bubbly, and you just love her. And then the guy is like this grumpy, sullen, quiet, like very reserved person who, you know, just doesn't trust anyone, has this tragic backstory, but their dynamic between the two of them is so cute. I loved it so much. I was rooting for them throughout. I thought that the trilogy as a whole was really strong. The second book was probably my least favorite, but the third book and how it wrapped everything up was so sweet. It was such a good conclusion. I thought it did such a good job of really being high stakes. There are some real consequences, but it's just, it's so cute. I absolutely loved this trilogy, and I am biased, of course. I love Japanese-inspired fantasy in general. I used to live in Japan, so I think that that's a big reason why I just love these types of stories and love exploring more of the mythology of, you know, Japanese culture and religions and that sort of thing. So I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who also loves Japanese-inspired fantasy. The next one I have is Fireborne by Rosaria Munda, and I'm going to be completely honest here and say that I need to reread this prior to completing the series, because I read this at a time where I had just had my baby. I was very sleep deprived, and I wanted to, you know, read some YA fantasies that were fun and could easily be an escape for me, and this was definitely that. But because I was reading this during that time in my life, I don't remember a whole lot of it, so I definitely need to reread it, but I just remember absolutely falling in love with the two main characters in this book, and I loved the political intrigue in this book. The world felt very, very fleshed out. The stakes felt very real. The political maneuvering felt very realistic as well. I just remember loving those aspects of this story. I thought it was so well done, especially for YA fantasy, where sometimes you don't get as complex of those types of political maneuverings. I thought that this did such a fantastic job of remaining firmly YA, but introducing those elements that now that I'm more into adult fantasy, I still like really appreciated seeing more explored and fleshed out. So I loved those aspects of this book. I just remember loving the ending of it. The two main characters and their dynamic is so fantastic, and how they came from completely different backgrounds and really should be enemies to each other and kind of have to work together because of certain circumstances, and it's just fantastic. So I do need to reread it. Do not get me wrong. I definitely do not remember enough to continue on with the series, but from what I do remember, I remember loving it and really enjoying the entire time I was reading this. So definitely recommend Fireborne. The next one I have is Winds of Strife by Yuji Gutman. This was a self-published adult fantasy novel that was so kindly sent to me by the author, and I am so happy that I ended up picking this up. This was absolutely fantastic, especially for a debut. I thought that this was so well done. I recommend this book to fans of Brandon Sanderson if what you like about Sanderson's books are his magic systems. This magic system in Winds of Strife is fantastic. It has to do with emotions and how if you can harness certain emotions, then you have abilities that can be produced from those emotions. Like for example, you can harness anger and that will give you the ability to manipulate fire. You can harness something like fear and that grants you influence over the person who is fearful of you. Like it's just really clever magic, and how that magic is used by our characters in so many different ways is really fascinating. Like we got a lot of really cool fight scenes and just other quieter like scenes of manipulation and that sort of thing using this magic system, and I loved exploring all these different ways that you could use the magic. I also really liked the world. I thought the world building was fantastic. The one thing I will say about this book, I personally loved the character work in this book. I thought that the characters felt very well realized. They felt like real people, and you could tell everyone had a very distinct voice and personality. It was very easy to tell the cast of characters apart. So I really liked the character work in this book, and a lot of them are very morally gray, where they're definitely not good people, but they're very fascinating to learn more about. So if you prefer books where you follow likable characters, I would not necessarily recommend this one, because the characters, especially our main character of Nye that we follow a couple different main characters, but Nye is the one on the front and is like the main character. He is not a great human being. He does some really bad things. So he is not the easiest to root for. In fact, you don't root for him at all. But I personally, as a reader, don't have to like my characters to find them fascinating. I still was really interested and intrigued with following Nye and seeing kind of how he would manipulate a certain situation or that sort of thing. So that is the one thing I will say. I love the magic. I think anyone who appreciates Sanderson's magic systems will love this, but the one caveat being the characters, which I personally really enjoyed, but I can see others not loving quite as much because they're not good people. So I do highly recommend this one. It definitely had to make the top 10, and I can't wait to read the sequel. So hopefully it comes out soon. Looking at you, Yuri. All right, now before we get to my favorite book of the year, which is probably not the most original favorite. I've seen it on quite a few best books of 2021 videos already. But before we get to that one, I wanted to quickly mention the 3 books that I'd already mentioned in the previous video. So I've already talked about them quite a lot this year, but I wanted to, of course, shout them out here. How could I not talk about them at least one more time? And that is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Amazing, beautiful, so unique, adult fantasy that is, it takes place in like a pre-Columbian America where a lot of the world building is based kind of off of that setting, and it creates this really unique world and magic and lore, and it's just so unique and beautiful and creative, and I loved the world in this book. But even beyond loving the world, I loved the characters. I loved them. I loved Serapio. I loved Ziala. I love all of them. They're so amazing. The dynamic between Serapio and Giala, I think is how you pronounce her name. They're so cute. I love them. So I love this book. I've talked about it quite a few times already, but I highly recommend checking this one out. I know that a lot of folks have issue with the ending. The ending personally didn't affect the experience and the enjoyment for me because I loved the journey getting there. I will agree that the ending was a little bit like abrupt, like, whoa, what the heck just happened? But I'm hoping that the second book kind of picks up where we left off and explains some things and fleshes out some things. But I loved the entirety of this book, even with the ending being a little bit more abrupt. So highly recommend this one if you haven't checked it out already. A City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. I did finish the entire Divine Cities trilogy, and I will say that City of Stairs is still firmly my favorite because it follows my favorite of our main characters in this book. In each of the following books, we follow kind of a different main character, and I really like the other two books, but I just prefer this one a little bit more. Very political, the world building's fantastic. I love the mythology with the gods and how each of the different gods kind of created their own land in this world. It was just so fascinating, and like what happens when those gods disappear, how are the people left to handle that? Like, it was just so cool. I loved the magic, and the horror elements were so good in this book. Oh, I love this one. I love this one. The whole trilogy is great, but this one was my favorite. And then finally, oh my god, last of the ones I've already talked about, but certainly not least, Ruin by John Gwynne. And I had to pick Ruin of all four of them. In The Faithful and the Fallen, I did also finish Valor and Wrath, and 5 stars for those as well. They were amazing, but Ruin just had some of those moments with battles and characters and duels and just ending and like, oh my god, just amazingness. Like, throughout, I was just on the edge of my seat. I couldn't stop reading. I love the characters. I love this world. Oh my god. The action scenes were amazing. I just can't help but gush about this series. I love it so much. So yeah, this one was my favorite because of some of those moments, but the whole quartet is amazing. Malice, I think I ended up giving 4.5 stars just because it was a really slow start, but once you get into it, oh, it's so good. I know that The Faithful and the Fallen in general has some mixed reviews out there, so I definitely know it's not for everyone, but if you love like classic epic fantasy with chosen ones and angels and demons and good versus evil and political maneuvering and backstabbing and betrayals and just like, what? This is it. This is it. I love it. All right. Favorite of the year, and I read it in December, I think. I love it so much. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Is anyone surprised? I don't think so. I mean, my god, this book. I thought I loved The Martian, and don't get me wrong, I still love The Martian. This somehow tops it. How does this top it? I don't understand. So this one, I really don't want to say anything about the summary. I'm just going to tell you it is about an astronaut who wakes up in a spaceship in the middle of space without any memory and has no idea how he got there, has no idea what's going on, and you're slowly discovering how he got there. It is just everything I love about books. It's like it's a survival story, but it's so much more, and the mystery and how it's told. I loved finding out the mystery slowly with the character. I loved discovering how we got there, and then once we figure it out, where do we go from there? I loved it all. There is a character that is introduced in this book that is my favorite character ever. Love this character. If you know, you know. If you know, you know. It is so good. And it's such a bummer because if you've read this book, you know, like, how do you talk about it without spoiling it? You can't. So all I can do is like be like, I love it. And yeah, more gushing. I can't even tell you like why, because it's a spoiler. just go read it. Just go read it. So what I'll say, I think this is how I can talk about it without spoiling it. In comparison to The Martian is very much at its heart about humanity and survival and just the strength of humanity and what can happen if we all work together on something. And while all of that is still present, I think in Project Hail Mary for sure, this one expands upon that and is much more far-reaching, I will say, than The Martian. The Martian felt a little bit smaller in scope and reach, and this one feels more epic in scope and a lot more ambitious. The other thing I'll talk about is just the way Andy Weir writes, and his version of science fiction is the most approachable that I've ever read so far in sci-fi. He writes such detailed scientific equations and situations and things where you are like, if any other author was writing this, I would be so lost. But Andy Weir does it in a way where you can still follow exactly what's going on, and it makes you feel brilliant. You're like, oh my God, I actually know what's going on with all of this like complex science going on, and I feel smart. Like, he makes you feel smart because you're like, okay, I can follow this. It's amazing. I don't know how he does that so well. It's completely deserving of the hype. I loved it. I loved it. I don't know how it topped The Martian. I know a lot of people say it is a copy of The Martian. I think it is a more ambitious version of The Martian, and the introduction of a character puts it over the top for me. That's all I'll say. I love it. Can't recommend it enough. Go read Project Hail Mary. Those are my top 10 favorites of the year. Did you see any that you've read? What did you think of them? What was your favorite book of the year for sci-fi fantasy? I would love to know. Next video will be my favorite non-sci-fi fantasy books. So everything else, thrillers, contemporaries, everything else that I read will be next video. So I can't wait to share that list with you all. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.